Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition of the F.A.I.R Dialogue. After last week's session on feminism and how gender equality is not merely a plea for women, but a plea for equality across race, religion, class, caste, and regions, this week we dive deeper into another form of divide that is equally prevalent in society today: the research divide between what is popular and what is relevant. A question that some of you have asked us in the past is, how does one continue to stay true to what one believes in, especially when it does not conform to the popular narrative? As young adults, how do you continue to work in areas that do not provide adequate job opportunities, funding support, or even adequate acknowledgement that could otherwise keep you going? These questions are extremely relevant, and admittedly, especially in India, the answer often tends to be one that leads us to submitting to the predefined norms of our society. Some of you have heard me speak about how convenience is the cause of a lot of the world's ills and how commerce dictates a majority of the narrative that is thrust upon us. When I first read about Julia's work, there was a lot of it that seemed obvious in what she says. When I last spoke with her, I in fact asked her why it has taken so long for her message to be more widely accepted, in spite of it being as obvious as it is. We both laughed, and the reasons, though remained unspoken, were evident to both of us. Quick story before I get off screen. Unknowingly, for about 2.5 months during this lockdown, I went without consuming any processed sugar, with my only sugar dose coming from fruits and the carbs that I ate. Then, one afternoon, a lemon cheesecake landed on my plate. That day, I went to bed at 7 p.m., long before what is otherwise bedtime for me. I couldn't keep my eyes open. My head felt as if it was hit by a ton of bricks. My entire body was palpitating, or so it seemed. And more worryingly, my mood, well, let's just say it wasn't the most pleasant. But I've heard a lot of people speak about how addictive sugar is, and some going to the extent of comparing it to cocaine. Now, I'm not a doctor. I don't have any research behind me. But just by listening to my body, I know that it felt wrong. What we eat impacts how we feel and behave. We experience it every day. Yet the world refuses to acknowledge that what we eat can also impact the way that our brain functions and help treat the issues faced by our brain. While my cheesecake story admittedly may seem like it's trivializing the issue at hand, but for me, it was again a reminder of being aware of our bodies and what we do to them. Now, unlike me, our guest today has spent over 20 years researching the impact of nutrition on mental health in regulated doses and not just diets, something that should otherwise be accepted as being obvious, as I mentioned previously. But yet, due to numerous reasons, many of which we have spoken about in the past, including convenience and commerce, she and many like her continue having to consistently spread awareness person by person. While on the other hand, in today's world, misinformation spreads like wildfire. As with Kamala Bhasin last week, Dr. Julia Rucklidge, Julia, is a testament to her own conviction. And I, for one, am glad that she continues to do what she does. As while her work may revolve around nutrition and mental health, the ramifications of her efforts transcend far beyond everything that is worth advocating for on our planet. Welcome, Julia. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking to a totally different an audience from far, far away from me, and at least in a decent time zone, so it's not too late.
Yeah, no,
So
we're eager to hear what you have to say, Julia. And I know there are many questions that our viewers have sent in already for you, but before that, we're just keen and we're all ears to hear what you have to say. So
sure.
over to
Well,
you.
I think okay. So I thank you for the introduction, and I think it gave me a few things to touch on in this this initial intro speech of what do I do. Um, One thing that you said, it should be obvious, and that everyone should know that what you put in your mouth is going to influence how you feel. And now, to me, that's really obvious. And if you've ever done a famine, even if 24-hour famine or or even if it was Ramadan, and where you've got a famine every day, or you're essentially stopping eating for an extended period every day. Probably one of the experiences that many people have is that they do experience changes in their cognition, their energy levels. They might find that their moods change. They may be more irritable. So we all have that kind of data ahead of us that we can draw on to realize that when you stop eating and you starve yourself, even for a limited amount of time, that can very much influence your mood. Um, so it really should be one of those obvious things, but it's something that I think we've forgotten. And I think all I'd like to do is put the idea back on the map as being relevant and incredibly relevant for mental health. But just to give you a bit of background, or to give your listeners a little bit of background, I am a trained clinical psychologist. I'm not a dietitian. I'm not a nutritionist. Everything I've learned about food has been after my qualification. So after I got my PhD back in the late 1990s. So I was taught as a clinical psychologist that food was pretty much irrelevant to treating very serious mental disorders, things like ADHD, or bipolar disorder or psychosis. These are very serious conditions that only medications or psychotherapy could help. That was the traditional teachings that I had. And I would say that's pretty much the norm of most people who go through any kind of mental health profession, either be that psychology or social work or medicine or psychiatry. That's the kind of that's the overall assumption, is that food really isn't going to play a very big role in assisting in the treatment of these disorders. So just take that framework as the background for me and for many people, or most people who work in this field. And I think that's been driven by a few different forces. One of them is that the pharmaceutical industry really gained hold on psychiatry in the sort of 1970s, 1980s, maybe even a little bit earlier. But certainly in some fields really took off with, say, something like Prozac, which came out in the 1980s and was deemed the miracle cure for depression. Or some of the medications like Ritalin for ADHD, they were viewed as absolute game changers when it came to the treatment of mental illness. And I think initially they really were wonderful for many people. But as the data has been collected over the years and over the decades, we've realized that not enough people are getting well. I think that's the fundamental data that I always draw on, is that if these drugs were so amazing, then we wouldn't have a mental health crisis in New Zealand, in India, in Europe, in North America. We would have a lessening of problems rather than an increasing problems. So I think the first thing that we need to recognize is that treatments that we have currently aren't helping enough people. And I think the second thing that's also happened is that there's been dramatic changes in the foods that we eat. So if we think about traditionally what our ancestors ate, it's very, very different. It probably doesn't look anything like what our young people are eating today. So there's been this huge change in a very, very short period of time, and certainly not enough time for us to evolve to be able to digest the foods that are on our plates these days, or many of the foods that are on our plates these days, especially the packaged, ultra-processed foods. So our diet has changed dramatically over a very short period of time, from eating mostly whole foods, fruits and vegetables, and your meats, and your nuts, and your legumes, complex carbohydrates, to eating these foods that I wouldn't even call foods, ultra-processed. We call them ultra-processed foods. That's your packaged foods. Those are your foods that are going to be high in sugar, like you were describing, that lemon, that cheesecake that was likely had perhaps a lot of white sugar in it. I don't know how they made it, but that's my guess given the reaction you had. So we've had this dramatic change in the food. In fact, 2/3 of foods that are sold in New Zealand supermarkets, I don't know if this is the same in India, I'd be really interested to know, but 2/3 of the foods that are sold in supermarkets here are ultra processed. So that's your very long list of ingredients. It'll have your, many things in there that have got numbers are describing the ingredient rather than a name like, broccoli or rice or other things that we recognize. And ultimately, these foods we've come to recognize are very good. They do have things like your proteins, your macronutrients, like your proteins, your fats, your carbohydrates. They've got calories, but they are probably depleted. Well, very likely depleted, and in many cases, we know they are depleted in your micronutrients, and you alluded to those, like the minerals and vitamins. And I think that's a really important public message to get out there, is that we have focused very much on these macronutrients, the fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, and concerned about making sure that we eat those foods in an appropriate ratio. And for some diet people who, follow a low carb diet, then obviously they'll have higher fat and higher protein. But ultimately thinking about those foods and making sure we get those right, but paying absolutely no attention whatsoever to vitamins and minerals. And I think that's been one of the big errors in the messages that are being given to us or to the public around food. So if you think about food pyramids, they never talk about the intake of vitamins and minerals. And I always find that curious. It's like, well, why not? Or if you look at, sometimes there's like traffic light systems that'll tell you what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat. And oftentimes it's actually about what you shouldn't eat. Like I'll say you need to eat, have something low in sugar and low in salt, low in calories, but it won't say what you should eat. So there's this confusion over, well, what should I eat? And I think that allows a lot of people to come in and just give their own opinions that may not necessarily be based in science. So coming to these, what I is my favorite are these micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals, and that's what I've been studying. Is that I think we need to start to really get the message out about why we should care about our intake of vitamins and minerals. And it's pretty simple. If we look at any kind of biochemical process that's going on in your brain, your neurons talk to each other. And how do they talk to each other? Well, we know they talk to each other often with neurotransmitters. And your audience will be familiar with some of those, like serotonin, which is known as a mood regulating neurotransmitter, or they might have heard of dopamine, one that we know is probably important in, say, paying attention, your concentration, for example, or putting the brakes on. And that, but what they probably may not know is that in order to make dopamine and make serotonin, you need multiple different vitamins and minerals. And we call them cofactors, and they help the enzymes and they help the process along. And if you don't have vitamins and minerals in your diet, then it's going to compromise your body's ability to make these very simple things, these neurotransmitters. And then you extend that and you think, okay, well, you actually need these vitamins and minerals to make hormones and other chemicals that are important for your body to function optimally. Your mitochondria that makes, it's the powerhouse of your cell. It provides the energy in the form of ATP. You look at that and you go, it needs vitamins and minerals. So if you're eating a diet that's high in processed foods, these ultra processed foods, you're simply not going to be getting these nutrients that your body needs. So it's not surprising for me to hear how that sort of potential depletion that might have happened for you in that very short period of time might have had an impact on your energy. I don't know, but it's sort of just, just to tie it back to that story that you told us. So that's the sort of the picture that I see about how important it is that we become more educated and more knowledgeable about thinking about the nutrient density of our food, and to be concerned when the foods that we eat are depleted in these nutrients. And they are, one of the most obvious ways how they might get depleted is going to be that you simply don't consume them because you have a diet that's very high in processed foods. But another challenge that we have is that in order to feed the billions of people on the planet, we make a lot of shortcuts in the growing of foods, and we favor foods that grow very quickly. For example, that have crops that have a high yield, and that's going to influence how dense it is, because the minerals have to be taken up from the soil. The plants don't make minerals. They make vitamins, but they don't make minerals. So they have to come up. And so if you grow a plant very quickly, then you have a smaller time frame and opportunity to get those minerals into the plant. So that's going to influence the mineral density of the food. So a whole bunch of things that are happening in terms of agriculture is going to influence the nutrient density of our food as well. So we've got a lot of things playing against us. But that gives you your audience sort of the backdrop about why I care so much about those vitamins and minerals. But on top of that, we have a massive amount of research now that also supports this perspective about food being relevant to mental health. And so just to give your audience a little bit of an overview of that, and I know some of it will come up later in the questions, but we've got a lot of research that, first of all, shows that your dietary pattern seems to be important in terms of mental health outcomes. So there's that research. But then there's the research that we've been doing, which is very controlled studies using vitamins and minerals in a pill form and comparing that to a placebo, and identifying that those people who received the active ingredients tend to do much better in their mental health symptoms that we are monitoring, like, say, for example, mood or stress or ADHD, depends on the study that we've been conducting. But we've done a lot of different studies across many different mental health issues. And so that in itself absolutely says to us, and should be startling for people who have thought that, had been taught that nutrition was irrelevant to our brain and brain health. The fact that we are finding just giving people vitamins and minerals has a positive effect on their mental well-being should make us all pay attention to the fact that what we eat and what we consume is going to be relevant to our brain. So how is that for an overview of where I come from and what I do?
Extremely interesting, and a lot of questions popping up in my head at this point in time, because there's just so much within what you just said right now that I want to know much more of. But where perhaps I'd like to start is, is just personal, what I've been seeing around me, friends, colleagues, and so on and so forth. What we see with our elders, our parents, our grandparents, and so on and so forth, is the fact that no one's really spoken to us about this ever, right? Just in terms of the relevance and importance of the micronutrients in that sense. And you got it spot on, in my opinion, as that everything that we're taught right from school to thereafter is about the food pyramid. It's about the red light, green light, yellow light, and all of that, none of which covers the vitamins. So how could everybody have got it wrong, Julia? Is really my question. That so many people, and you keep seeing, and that's what probably ends up happening, is that you keep seeing so many people who've lived their lives maybe very well as well, some not so well, but they've lived their lives, they've been strong, they've achieved things, they've done things, and you're suddenly like, okay, look, but they didn't focus on the micronutrients at all, did they? But they still managed, right? And which is where I keep talking about convenience. It's easy for us to believe the fact that, oh, what's been happening for so long, we can just continue that way and things are going to be okay. So how do we combat that? And how is it that people in all of these centuries and all of these years didn't really focus too much on this?
Right.
And now that for us too.
Okay, so there's lots I can respond to in your question. I think the first thing is that I think that our ancestors did know. I think our ancestors did know that food was relevant and important. And if you go back historically and you look at, say, Hippocrates, what did he say? He said, let food be your medicine, right? So, and he also knew about the importance of gut health and the microbiome in the way that you could understand it back then. So I'd say we do have these fathers who knew about the importance of food. And then if you look at pioneering times in the North America or in Europe, I don't know about India, but I'm sure there'd be similar things. I mean, in India, traditional medicines have trumped for the longest time. And our conversation we had before was just identifying that only recently have we moved away from this idea that we can cure everything from our environment and from the herbs that exist and from the foods that exist. It's only recently that we've been doing this. Because if you look at the pioneering times, they knew that insanity was just simply imperfect nutrition. That was the cause of insanity. So I think historically we knew it, and then I, in more modern times, we've thought science has developed. I think science may play the way we conduct science might play a role, because one of the things that's important in science is you try to manipulate only one variable at a time. And that allows you to be able to feel very confident that whatever that one variable was is causal in the changes that you then might observe as a scientist. So when it comes to, say, pharmaceuticals are one molecule. And so we can know then that one molecule is what might have led to a behavioral change, for example. So then they use that same model on nutrition. And nutrition isn't one molecule. It's our diets are complex, and there's a reason we evolved to need all of these different nutrients in combination. So we then apply, though, that kind of one molecule idea, and we apply it to nutrition. And there have been studies that have been done on nutrients since early 1900s, but they only looked at one nutrient at a time. And so they were searching for that magic nutrient. And I'm forever hearing about the magic nutrient, and I get emailed about it all the time. Just tell me what nutrient I need to take. Is it magnesium? Is it zinc? Vitamin D? And I say it's the wrong question. You're thinking about this the wrong way, because if you again go back to what I said before around the biochemical processes and making serotonin, it's not one nutrient. You just have to, if you understand the biochemistry, and I've spent a lot of time relearning chemistry. I did it as science as an undergraduate, but doing psychology, I moved away from that. So I've come back to my roots, and got, of course, enzymatic processes need a number of different cofactors. It's not just one. And if you only give one, then you cause a depletion in others. So, but we've taken that scientific approach, I think, may play a role in why we've been led astray, and we've been really lured into this idea that there's magic solutions out there. And so we are always hopeful that we're going to find that one cure, that one drug that's going to cure everything. And you see it now. We see it now within the context of COVID-19. It's rampant of looking for that magic cure, that magic treatment. And I argue that for many things, not all, I think there are going to be some cases where you do have a one drug treatment, but in many cases, our brains are more complex than that. And to think that we're going to find that magic solution may be one of the reasons why we've kind of gotten it wrong for a few decades.
Yeah, no. So in a way, what you're saying, and I completely agree with that. Again, because I've seen a lot of illness in my family, just in terms of being treated for one illness. By the time you're okay with that, you suddenly realize you've got something else, and then you're being treated for that, and so on and so forth. Because you're not really looking at the entire body as a whole, and you're just treating one illness at a time. And I've experienced that myself in my family quite a bit. So broadly, a little differently, perhaps, I do understand what you're saying, but. What I understand of what you just said right now, perhaps, and I think this is the absolute converse of what I said about what you're doing being so obvious, right? And the reverse of that is that it's extremely complicated to actually get scientific validation for what you're doing, because as what you
Exactly.
said very, very correctly, it's not one molecule at a time. You're looking at an interplay of so many different micronutrients, and how the interplay, the way that they react, what one with the other. And but again, I think I don't want to go down the path of trying to explain it at all, right? Because I can't. But if you can at least I'm extremely eager to try and understand how many combinations are there. How many micronutrients are we really talking about? Because
Yeah.
what you just said right now just seems like such a massive challenge, right?
It is it is a massive challenge. And I don't profess to be able to tell you all about all those interactions. The faith that I have in it is that it's biologically driven. And so it's based on what we know about the body needing about 15 vitamins and about 15 minerals. So we're looking at about a total of 30 ingredients. So there are probably more that we haven't discovered. So I don't want to say that that's it, that there's that 30, but that 30 seems to pretty much cover those micronutrients that we need. But I'm ignoring other things that are also in food that are probably really important that we're only starting to even begin to get our head around, like phytonutrients. There's like 60,000 of those. So I'm not there. We're not there yet. And that might explain why we don't have 100% success rate. We're not, not everyone gets better. We see many people get better. I would say 50% absolutely fantastic improvements. We see about 30% getting, seeing some changes, but not a full recovery. And then 20% no change whatsoever. So it could be that we haven't gotten it all covered yet. But 30 is about what I would say and that's approximately the number of ingredients that we use in the formulas that we study. Now, understand, I don't put them together. This is not my brains that's put these combinations together. That was actually farmers in southern Alberta, Canada, they just applied what they had learned from what's relevant for animal feed to make sure that your animals are well nourished, that they don't get irritable, that they don't bite each other's tails and ears and other things. Farmers know that it's really important to ensure that you have a breadth of nutrients. So the formulas that we study simply come out of that idea, animal research, animal nutrition, and actually, interestingly, was applied to families who were struggling with mental health issues and hadn't been adequately treated from conventional medicine. So that's the backstory to what I do. All I did was be the scientist who said, you know what? This seems like a bit of an unusual, weird idea because it didn't fit my thinking and the way I had been trained. But if they're claiming they're treating serious psychiatric disorders just with nutrients, someone needs to study this. And that's all I did. I just studied it. So that's why you have a psychologist who has no background in nutrition studying this idea. Because nutritionists, of course, didn't think that they'll say just eat a good diet. You don't need extra nutrients. So, it took somebody from outside of the field to come in and go, I know how to run a clinical trial. That's something that I'm trained as a scientist to do. Let me put this to the test. Let's compare it to a placebo. Let's see what we find. And I was very skeptical. I didn't, and I mean, now, of course, I understand why I was so wrong. But at the time, I was like, well, why would we would have discovered this by now. Somebody would have figured this one out. But actually, I was one of the early people to do the research. So.
Yeah, and I think that just so beautifully takes us to the first question that I want to ask from our viewers. We have Ayush who sent in a question quite related to what you just said right now, where he spoke of the fact that just the role of food in one's day-to-day life is considered to be a placebo effect, right? So as people say that, because you've had a full meal, hence you're acting this way, right? Or you haven't eaten for a while, that's why you're acting this way. And it just seems it's common parlance to try and relate someone's mood to whether they're hungry or whether they've eaten much. But it's, as I said, it's people think of it as a placebo effect. But why is it, as what you just spoke of right now, that nutritionists before others who've been researching this didn't take this more seriously? Why is it that a mental health expert effectively has to take this up more seriously? Is it, and
Yeah.
that's the interlink, right? Is it more of what's lacking? Is mental health awareness lacking? Is that what is lacking? Or is it the scientific rigor of those who were actually studying nutrition and so on and so forth, and their intent or application toward this which is lacking?
Right. Okay. Let's see if I can answer this question. So does the lack of awareness about the role of food stem from the lack of science? Well, okay. Well, I mean, as we alluded, I mentioned in my introduction that we all actually know how important food is, and that
Mm.
in the sense of if you are depleted of, if you don't eat for a while, you know that there's something wrong. Um, so I'm a little confused about the question around it being associated with the placebo effect, because the placebo effect is something, and you brought that up here, because for me the placebo effect is where you get better just because you think you've
Mm.
consumed something that should make you feel better. And I guess I can okay, I can kind of see where that's coming from. um so why is it that we don't, I'm still, I find this I think I
No,
said I was
it's,
going to
it's just
struggle
that
answering this question. um
yeah,
so if you can try that one again with me,
yeah, yeah,
let me
Julia.
see if I can try that one again. Give it like
No,
clear question.
so effectively, when you're looking at this interlink between nutrition and one's mental health, right? So there are two
Yes.
types of professionals involved, right? As what you said rightly, one is the nutritionist, the scientists who are looking at nutrition and so on and so forth, and then there is those psychologists like yourself, right, who are dealing with mental health. And
Hmm.
between those two professionals, at least I would assume
Yeah.
that it's the first set,
Yeah.
which
Why haven't
actually
they? Yeah.
more
Yeah.
seriously, why
Okay.
haven't they? Has it taken a psychologist to look at something of this sort, or should it
Yeah.
have been the
Okay.
reverse? Or is this what should have
Yeah.
been natural in the case, because you understand mental health better, so you will
Yeah.
then thereafter? Is that the obviousness of it, or is it what at least I believe that it should have been done earlier?
Okay. Okay. Well, I think I'll give it a stab at that. So I think it's partly because we get, I think in any type of training, you really get molded into that guild, that mindset, and it's like you're moving into a profession that you then need to defend. You need to protect it, and I'm not being particularly positive, but it's what happens when you train for many years as a clinical psychologist. I trained for to become a clinical psychologist in Canada, which is where I originally trained. It took me 11 years to get there. So, 4 years undergraduate and a 5-year master's PhD alongside clinical psychology training, and then a 2-year postdoc. So that is a long time to be indoctrinated into a certain worldview. So you could, about what mental health is, what mental health disorders are. You spend a lot of time just understanding it. There's been a lot of research. So you get a worldview of it. We're taught about diagnostic categories, that everybody fits into these different classifications, like depression or anxiety or psychosis. So you're taught about all of that, and you have faith in the system that you're, and the education that you're taught, and it's hard to stray away from that. So you're taught, and then I'm taught as a psychologist about how to intervene using the relationship, and just helping people challenge their thinking styles, or or challenging their behaviors so that they can do things in a different way, etc. So you're taught some very specific skills. So I think part of what happened for me was that it all was it was a wonderful training, and wonderful, I learned a lot, and it all made sense. But at the end of the day, I thought, from my perspective, not long into as a trained clinical psychologist, I realized a lot of people weren't getting well despite getting these amazing treatments that made sense. So maybe one thing that might be a little bit different for me is that I have a really critical mind. And I'm not being, I'd say, well, I'm sure there's lots of people out there who think that way, but not always, because you get indoctrinated into a certain way of thinking. So I think the same thing happens with dietitians. The same thing's going to happen with physicians. Physicians aren't given any nutrition training, or very little. So they're not going to think that nutrition is going to be relevant to the health of their patients. When it comes to dietitians, I already alluded to that, which is that they're trained to think you can get all of your nutrients from your diet, all of the nutrients that you need. But that's ignoring some very, really important things. And that is that we're all genetically different. And so what I didn't say earlier around, some of the reasons why some of us might need more nutrients than we can get out of our food, I talked about, well, the food you're eating is crap. so it's nutritionally depleted. So that's one reason. There's the environmental things that are happening in terms of growing our foods. We don't replenish the soil with all the nutrients. That's going to play a role. But there's also individual differences that I think mean why some people might need more nutrients than they can get out of their food. And that is that, say, for example, we might inherit what's called an inborn error of metabolism. That just means your metabolic pathways are sluggish, slow. And when that happens, it just means that, say, the making of the ATP is going to be compromised. You're going to just feel low energy most of the time, because it's just your body has a harder time making that chemical reaction to occur because it doesn't have as much enzyme available. Well, one way to correct this is just giving more vitamins and mineral cofactors. It's amazing, but we know that can happen. So what dietitians are neglecting when they say you should be able to get all your nutrients out of food, what they're ignoring is that individual differences, that some people may have a genetic difference to need more nutrients. And I think a great way to illustrate this one, and it's sort of an analogy that I came up with and thought about, was that the sailors in the 1600s got scurvy. Everyone hopefully knows that story. And they got scurvy because they didn't have an adequate supply of vitamin C, which we know we get from citrus fruits. 40% of sailors died from scurvy until they figured this out, and then we've cured scurvy now. But not 100% of them died. Only 40% of them died. So why didn't the other 60% die? And I think that would, because they're all probably eating a similar diet. They're all on the same ship. I mean, maybe some of them are able to sort of wrangle a little bit more food than someone else, or, but overall they've got the same diet, and yet they didn't all die, which suggests that they came on board that ship with different genetics, perhaps a different, maybe, reserves in them from the diet that they were eating before. But there's definitely some individual differences that resulted in only some of them dying, but not all of them. And you could apply that analogy probably to pretty much anything. Why is it when you get, again, sorry to take a current analogy, but why is it if you get exposed to COVID, not everyone dies? A certain percentage of people die. What is the difference? Is it their immune function, underlying medical conditions? Is it their age? Whole host of other factors which influence that. So that's all I'm thinking of, is that there is going to be that underlying differences that do mean some people might need more nutrients than they get out of their food. So I guess all of that to say is that, in answer to hopefully to that question, is that we all have this way of indoctrinated into a way of thinking about our profession, our career. And it's very hard for, once you've really been, you spent a lot of time in there, it's then hard to kind of step out of it and look at it from the outside and evaluate it critically. So that's why I think it takes somebody sometimes from outside of that profession to just kind of go, let's look at this, because you don't come with any of those preconceived biases. You're just looking at it fresh. And that's happened a lot historically too. There's been, a lot of discoveries have been from people who were outside of that profession.
Yeah, no, I think spot on, in my opinion. I think that's really, while you were talking as well, you started off by saying that you're extremely critical, but guess what? Many other people are. But that's the difference, right? So while there may be a lot of people who are critical, not everybody puts it to the right use.
Well, I think you need
and
to be
that ability
resilient.
to be critical, right?
Because it's not easy challenging the status quo.
No. And that's actually my next question to you. That when you're doing something of this sort, right, and when you're challenging the popular narrative, as it may be, right, and one of the comments I'm just reading on chat also just speaks about this whole thing about doctors, and especially in India, I don't know how actively it happens outside India, is when they've got you on all of these medicines, and then you ask them, doctor, what can I eat, or doctor, is there anything that I need to stay away from? No, don't worry, the medicines are doing their job. right? Or you eat what you want, be happy, right? Like they just put off that whole concept conversation of diet. But anyway, that's a separate thing. Of course, if you want to address it, please do. But my question really is, when it's not the popular narrative, when you know that governments and corporations, it's going to be tough to
Yes.
get that sort of support for something
Yeah,
of this
that's
sort.
right.
We've already discussed reasons why, right? Costs and commerce and so on and so forth. Um, how how have you actually managed to be in a place where we sitting in India, for example, right, know of you, we know of your work, we know what you've been doing, right? I'm sure that there are other people across the world as well who've managed to end up coming across your work in some way or the other. But that whole thing about resilience that you spoke of, 20 plus years of doing this, I am so certain that there would have been times, and at least I think that there would have been times in the middle of somewhere there where you're wondering to yourself that, where am I headed? Because why is it that people are not listening to what I have to say? Is that something that you had to face, or did your resilience take you over that and
Right.
okay?
Yes, absolutely. You have hit it spot on. It has crossed my mind more than once. Why the hell am I doing what I'm doing? Why do I keep going? And and the obstacles are many, and sometimes they come from they're curveballs that you never expected would come in front of you, and really try very hard to stall what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. So, just to name a few, it's hard to get money. That's the first thing. It's hard to get the grant money to do this research. So that's one of the big stumbling blocks. Even when you do the research, it's hard to publish it. The journals aren't interested. They tell you they're not interested. They tell you that their readers aren't interested, and they reject it almost outright without even going through peer review. Even though I know that the study has been done incredibly well, we're so careful with how we do our research. It's robust. It follows a drug model in the sense of how we conduct it. So I know that you can't find fault in what we found, and we report it very. We always report all our findings. They're not always consistent. There's always variability, and that's the story in science. But we report them as we find them. So so those are just two. And then there's people who don't believe our studies, our research, and just say we've made up the data. We have people who want to know where all my money comes from because they don't believe I haven't received any money from the companies that make the products that we study. And that's something that's been really important to maintain independence, that they've never given us any money. But people don't believe that. So I have these, Official Information Act requests that come to me that say, we want to know where all of your funding has come from. And that I find, painful to have to go through, because it's saying I'm lying at the end of the day, right? And it's like, but I've declared it all. This is where our money came from, but they still want to see it. So, and the university is forced to have to provide that information, and I'm cleared because I haven't received any money from any of the companies. So, but that's happened to me several times. I get some nasty emails from people, just outright again accusing me of making up data. So that does happen, and more often than you think. Ethics committees have given us a really hard time. The first study that we ever wanted to do, they declined it. They said, no, we're not going to let you do it. It's unethical to give people nutrients. So I had to battle a lot. So how do you keep going? I would have to say that, we were talking about the TED thing. I think you were alluding to the flag that's on my TED talk that says, "Don't watch this talk." Yeah. So that was unbelievable when that happened. I was like, what the, where, why? Someone obviously complained and said that, I had falsified the data that I was presenting on the TED stage, and that we couldn't believe it, and they tried to, take it down, have it taken down. So, I had to fight that one tooth and nail to just even get the wording. I couldn't get the flag off of it, but I managed to get the wording changed ever so slightly, to where they say I oversimplified legitimate studies. So, which is, who doesn't oversimplify on an 18-minute talk? So that just gives your listeners a little bit, like really a small piece of what I've gone through. So I'll tell you what keeps me going. What keeps me going is the thousands of emails that I receive from members of the public who tell me they've heard about my work and they applied it to their friends and their families, and that it's been a lifesaver for them. or the people who come through our research where they've come, often when they come into our research studies, they're at the end of the road. They've tried medicines, they've tried psychotherapy, they've tried a whole host of different things. And so sometimes they'll be just told by their doctor, oh, why don't you go to that clinical trial because, nothing else has helped you. And they don't expect this to help them, but at least it gets them off their case for a while. So we've had kids in our trials who have been, expelled from multiple schools. Their parents are at their wits' end. They don't know how to, what to do about their kids' irritable, angry outbursts, their temper tantrums, their explosive rage. And then they're given nutrients, and we see a completely transformed child, so it's those stories that always keep me going. And it's always those emails that tell, that remind me that what we're doing right now is simply not helping enough people. So the drugs out there, I'll get emails from people who say, my husband's been on multiple drugs. None of them help. Each time it seems to actually make him worse. And I think, how did we get to a stage in our society that we give medicines that make people worse and then give them more medicines to try to address the side effects that were caused by another medicine? How did we get to that stage of accepting this as good practice? That, it astounds me. Like if I go in and I have an infection, I expect that the drug that I'm given is going to cure that infection. I don't expect it to not only not cure me, but also cause a whole host of new problems. But that's what's a lot of this, unfortunately, the truth is, and the data support this and the research support this, that not enough people are getting well, and many people in the long term might even be getting worse. And so I feel it's my duty to speak out against that and to just call a spade a spade. And there's more and more people who are doing that. But I honestly, only probably in the last 10 or 15 years have I seen more people have that courage to speak out and say, this is what's happening, because it resonates a lot with the public. There'll be listeners out there who will go, of course, that's happened to me. I've been put on a drug and it didn't help me. But they'll often, when it comes to mental health, they'll think it's their fault. I hear this story a lot. I have such bad depression. I am so broken that not even these amazing miracle drugs can help me. That's often, so they'll blame themselves for why the drug didn't work. And that's such a common narrative that I often hear. And I think that's partly because of the stigma associated with mental illness, is that they don't want to admit that the medication that's supposed to cure them hasn't actually made a difference. So it's really, I would say, the public, the emails, the phone calls, that is what often will keep me, on those days where I'm going to give up, I look to those and I just have that inspiration to maybe go another day.
Yeah, and that resonates so much, Julia, because again, even at the FAIR project, right, we don't necessarily talk about what is the popular narrative, and more often than not, we're with the antithesis of the popular narrative. And just like what you mentioned right now, at our foundation, we've never taken a single rupee from anybody, right? Not a single dollar, rupee, or whatever it may be. And our reasons have been fairly simple, is because of what you're going through and what you've gone through. We don't want to even give anybody that opportunity or thought to say that, what we say is dictated by those who we've received the money from, right?
Yep.
And I can join you in telling the audience that it's extremely difficult, but if we want to try and find a way, we will find a way, as long as what you said, you talked about resilience, and the reason why we do it is frankly exactly what you said as well, right? From our standpoint, the reason we do it is because there are people out there, like on this chat, who will come on, listen to conversations like this, be open to try and see different narratives, right? And then when they acknowledge that, yes, that particular narrative actually makes sense to them, or it works for them, or it's helped them, it just takes one, right? It takes one person to come and tell you that what you're doing has helped me, and then that just keeps you going on for longer. And then when you reach a place where you get the thousands of people as you're getting telling you that the work that you've been doing has helped them, that's really all the motivation that one needs. So no, but thank you so much for that, right? But the next question that I want to ask is a question actually sent in to us by, again, one of our viewers, Shiparna, where she speaks, and a bit of what you've alluded to already in this conversation is, trained professionals. She's studying clinical psychology as well, right? But yet, in today's world and the way things are and so on and so forth, she wants to try and understand how does one who's studying all of this end up coping with stress, anxiety for themselves, right?
Right.
Because
Sure.
you're getting so close to understanding the various issues of mental health, right?
Yeah.
You're seeing them in a clearer light than most others. All of us have human tendencies. And one of the pieces that I wrote about a month ago was on mental health, saying that everybody needs to take care of the mental health, because everybody gets angry, everybody gets sad, everybody has those reactions, which at the end of the day, all emanating from here, right? So it is something for everybody, not just those who have diagnosed illnesses and so on and so forth. So that little bit of seed is there in each and everyone's mind. And when you get closer while studying something like clinical psychology, how do you try and cope with the stress and anxiety that offers, especially in light of what you've said, that it is so difficult to then take your research forward and to take the things that you have to say forward as well?
Sure. So I think what she's asking is something that's probably on a lot of minds, and it doesn't matter that she's studying clinical psychology, I assume, is that how does one cope with stress and anxiety and low mood? I think that's the kind of question that she's asking. That the fact that she's trained to be a clinical psychologist is just a piece of that. So I think the question I'm going to answer is how do we use this knowledge from our research to try to help people who are struggling with mental health issues? Does that sound about right? Yes?
Absolutely. Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'd say first of all, the foundation would be the foundation of getting to a place of wellness is to ensure that you have a good foundation of many things, but one of them is going to be a good foundation of nutrition. And so, as I was saying before, is that we've moved away from um, the our traditional dietary patterns, and we've started to embrace this ultra processed food. So hopefully your listeners are going to know what you really need to be doing is eating whole real food. And there's no magic to this. I don't there's no fad diet that I'm going to suggest to your listeners that they need to go for. I know there's been a lot of questions, and I can sort of just briefly touch on it. Should I go keto? Should I go vegan? Should I go vegetarian? I would say eat real whole food. And maybe down the road you might want to tweak that. If you're not quite at a place where you're feeling amazing, you might be one of those people who would benefit from reducing your carbohydrates, or you might be one of those people who might benefit from reducing meat intake. But ultimately, if you can follow the rule of eat real whole foods that your grandmother would recognize as food, then I think you're 90% of the way there. And decrease the amount of ultra processed foods that you're eating. So that is your packaged foods. That's your packaged noodles. That's your takeaways. That's your sugary drinks. That's your, those foods. And then increase your intake of your nuts, your legumes, your quinoa, your black beans, your lentils, your amazing spices that you have in India. Goodness. I mean, you have the most delicious, dietary patterns. Go back to the traditional Indian dietary pattern, and I think you're going to go a long way. So, and then, I'm not a big, when it comes to people who are struggling with mental health issues, the research is not saying you should cut out meat or fish, because we know that those are good sources of getting your B12, your iron, your zinc, your essential fatty acids. You can't as easily get the essential fatty acids out of a vegetarian diet. And that's kind of surprises people. But the research shows that it's the EPA and the DHA, which are specific types of omega-3 fatty acids, are what are going to be beneficial for mood and for attention. And it's not as easy to get EPA and DHA out of your a vegetarian source like linseed or through seaweed. Your best source is through fish. So I just put that out there because some people feel guilty about, eating, they might think they need to move towards a vegan vegetarian diet. And that may well be fine for many people, but for people who are struggling with a mental health issue, that may be part of the challenge because you're not adequately getting all the nutrients that your brain needs. So I've just mentioned a few of those important nutrients. So going back to the so what other things? So good foundation of food is going to be important. And then I alluded to that there are some people who may need more nutrients than they can get out of their diet. And I think the people who are struggling with mental health issues may be those vulnerable people who may have those genetic differences that mean that their metabolic pathways are more sluggish. And that's when you might want to use supplementation. If it's just stress, the B vitamins, there are B complex out there. There's tons of them. If you go to this, they often sell them in the supermarket. And that could be sufficient for someone who's just struggling with stress, but with vitamins. But if you've got more, more serious challenges, then I would say you need that breadth of the vitamins and minerals. And it's not that there's any specific formula out there that's magic, and not at all. And but there aren't a lot of formulas that have been developed specifically to help people who are struggling with mental health issues. So that's the challenge, is there's just simply not that much available. My lab provides all of that information to people who contact us. So just for the information of your listeners, if you just email us mental health nutrition, one word, at canterbury.ac.nz, then we provide you with all the different formulas that have been researched internationally all over the world, and say, well, these are the ones that have some evidence behind them, because not all supplements have been researched because they don't have to in order to sell them. So hopefully that gives the person who asked the question a little bit more of that information of what they need to start. But I don't want to discount a whole bunch of really other important things, which are things like, meditation, sleeping, getting adequate sleep, ensuring that you get your, 7 to 8 hours of sleep every night. Never compromise your sleep. Students often do that, and I'm like, no, you should never compromise your sleep. And in making sure that you get good social connections and you're well connected with other people and you seek out that social support. Those are going to go a long way in terms of supporting a good mental wellness package. So it's not going to just be one thing, but I always see nutrition as being the foundation, and then the other things to build on that foundation. But really, getting a good foundation of nutrition is going to be, I think, a core component of getting to a better place.
Yeah, I think the principle that you enumerated are similar in both cases, right? So when you're looking at dealing with with stress, anxiety, and so on and so forth, there's no one answer. You have to have a combination of everything that you spoke of. Similarly, when you break down into the kind of nutrition that you require, again, there is no one answer. As you mentioned very rightly, there are so many vitamins, minerals, micronutrients that all work together to try and help and assist. And going back to the front end of this conversation, it's not about one molecule, right? It is about the combination. It is about making sure that you can get everything to work in your favor towards whatever it is that you're solving.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I do have one more question for you. When we were talking, and I saw one of the comments here which spoke about overdosing on macronutrients, right? And that just triggered a thought in my head in terms of even micronutrients. Is there something like an overdose? Can you take too much of micronutrients, or is
too
that
much? No, you can. I mean, not anything is poison. It's always at the dose, isn't it? So so you could, you're more likely to have problems if you take a micronutrient on its own as a single nutrient. So if you were to just take, for example, zinc by itself, which many people do, then if you take too much of that, what that can do is cause a copper imbalance and cause a deficiency in copper. So there are a lot of those kinds of imbalances that are happening, that if you take one, you're going to increase the chances that will happen. Folic acid can mask a B12 deficiency, for example. So there are those. So yes, if you especially if you take one nutrient, then you're more likely to get to a place where you could cause problems. Taking them in combination, I our research shows that that's less likely to have a problem. Yeah, can you get to a point of overdosing? Yes, there are limits that are being identified that we generally try to adhere to, and those are limits that, when they did research and they went way above a certain dose of a certain nutrient, then it started to cause, certain adverse effects. So we're very well aware of those upper limits, and we're mindful that we don't usually approach them unless there's a good reason for it. So, for example, magnesium has quite a low upper limit, but that's because it can cause diarrhea when you get too high. But it seems our experience has been if you take magnesium alongside other nutrients, and also depends on the form of magnesium, then you don't have that problem. So you can take a higher dose of magnesium. So it's complicated. But yeah, we do need to be mindful of those, that anything in too great an amount is going to be a problem. Some nutrients, our bodies are very well equipped to deal with them and get rid of excess. So a lot of B vitamins, for example, are water soluble. So there's no limit that's put on B12, for example, because of that. Your body will just get rid of it if it what it doesn't need. But there are some that are fat soluble, and then that means that they're going to get stored in your body, and then that might cause more long-term chronic problems. So we do need to be mindful of that.
Yeah, no, I'm assuming we already have one request for your email ID again. So we'll drop that in on the chat that you gave right now. And I'm assuming you're going to get quite a few emails after this session
Yeah.
to try and
Well,
it because
the
yeah,
mental health nutrition email is one that my graduate students reply to. So I've trained them to reply to that email. So it's not me.
But what's fantastic is that you've made this information readily available. I think
Yeah.
that from my perspective is fantastic, because that's one of the problems that historically we've spoken about research, right? Is that once research is done, it's not accessible, and there are all these paywalls and firewalls and so on and so on, which is all good and well and fine, and I understand why they exist. But the moment something becomes socially relevant, I think what you're doing with your research is absolutely fantastic, in my opinion. So thank you so much for that. I know we've crossed the hour mark, but I can't let you go quite yet.
Okay.
We do have the one question that we ask everybody who comes on, and it's related to fairness, right? It's about what fairness means to you. It's about what being fair means to you, because it's everyone, like, as with a lot of things, everyone's got their own personal understanding of the word fairness. And from your perspective, for someone who has spent so much time doing what they love and what they've really been interested in spite of everything that you told us about what you had to face and what you continue to face, and I'm probably going to end up saying, and unfortunately you will continue to face as well, because the challenges are going to continue in your life for yourself. What is fairness for you? How do you look at the word fair and fairness in your life?
No, that's a good question. The way I would think about it, at least from this lens that we've been talking about today, is the fairness in terms of being able that everybody has a right to good, nourishing food. And at the moment, that's not the case. That people don't have, like, if you live in a poor community, then your access to, say, to fruit and vegetables is compromised, because just the shops that are around you are going to be selling more ultra processed foods. So that's not fair. In that sense, that the more deprived you are, the less access you have to good food. I think other things that just being able to get adequate and nourishing food, that every child should have access to good nourishing food, but that doesn't happen. And we have a whole bunch of political reasons why that doesn't happen. We also, we subsidize farmers to provide us with some of this ultra processed food. Why do we do that? Why do governments do that? Why do governments pay for pharmaceutical medicines, but they don't pay for the nutrients. So, well, how did we end up with the pharmaceutical companies having basically a monopoly over the public healthcare system? And the public healthcare system is for everyone, and that should be it should be that you have equal opportunity and access to the types of treatments that resonate with you. But instead, we are forced into having to only be able to accept the pharmaceutical model, or else you have to pay for it. So is that fair? That only those who are rich are able to access some of these alternative treatments that simply aren't provided through the public healthcare system. So hopefully that kind of addresses some of the things that I try very hard with my research, that we're trying to collect the type of data that is rock solid. It's impenetrable in terms of its really robust work, so that one day we can see some of this fairness addressed, so that more people can have access to it and more people can benefit from it, not just the rich.
I know I said that's the final question, Julia, but in your answer, I think there's just so much that you referred to, which if you still have a few more minutes and you'd be happy to talk to us for a little longer. This whole bit that you spoke about, governments and corporations not really benefiting from nutrition, and how it's so ridiculous, frankly, that's something that is sustenance, right? Which is the basic right, I would say the basic right of every individual is to have a nutritious meal, has become so distant in being able to be achieved. How have we reached here? Like, why? I mean, you talk about a lot of political reasons and so on and so forth. If it's okay with you, do you want to delve a bit more about why is it that the governments have kept nutrition away? Like, eventually ended up keeping nutrition away from those who needed them, all of us.
Well, I mean, you can be cynical, and you can think about conspiracy theories, and you can think that there's a whole bunch of wheeling and dealing that's going on in the background, and the big, the pharmaceutical companies are buying politicians, and all of that corruptness could be occurring. I mean, that can happen, and we know that can happen, and we know that happens. But it could just be a simpler thing, which is that they, just like the rest of us, are a product of our education, and our education has not emphasized the importance of nutrition. We don't teach children about how important nutrients are for our brain. We talk about it for maybe our muscles and for our heart, but we don't talk about it for our brain. So it could just be that simple lack of education, that the politicians think, well, if nutrition was so relevant, then the scientists would have told us. And so then we get back to being in a circle with what I'd said before, which is the scientists aren't talking about it because they weren't taught that. So is that perhaps a less cynical way to think about it? I find it more helpful to think about it that way, because otherwise you can just get despair in the corruption that is there. Or you can just think, maybe one of the roles that I can play is education. And one of the ways I'm doing this, and this is like a plug, I wasn't thinking, I just realized that I've put a lot of these ideas that we've talked about. I'm co-authoring a book that's written for the public. It's called The Better Brain. It's going to come out next year. But really, it's again about being able to provide all this information to the public in one place, because we want the research to get out there, and we want it to be accessible, and we want it to be understandable, so that we can change the world, and we can, hopefully get to a better place than we are now.
No, absolutely, and I think what you actually gave as this reason, I think it's what we all have to believe, right? And it stands to reason as well, because when we talk about, we have to remember that all politicians are human beings as well, right?
Yes.
And as with everyone else, all of us, many of us on this conversation today as well, we didn't know a lot of the things that you've spoken of, right? So if we are not aware, how do we react to that? How do we deal for it? So frankly speaking, like, in spite of all the corruption and conspiracy theories and so on and so forth. And you're very right. At the very least, that what we can do is educate them, make sure that they're aware of what's going on, make sure that they're aware of the importance of things such as this. And I'm really hopeful that there will be people on this conversation today who've learned that one thing from you, right? And for me, like of everything else that you've spoken of, I think just the relevance of education, the relevance of putting your thoughts out there, the relevance of acknowledging that the other person may be coming from a place of a lack of knowledge, not merely wrong intentions, right? Because the intention, you can't deal with wrong intentions to a large part, right? What's in your hand is to keep spreading the message and keep talking about what you need to be talking about. And I'm fairly certain that there'll be a lot of people on this chat who will help you spread the message of what you've said so far. And of course, I know that an hour is too little to understand all of what you've been doing, but at least in terms of spreading the broader message, there will be quite a few. I'm the first one of those, definitely.
I mean, what I encourage all of your listeners, this is it, is just be curious. Curious. Don't close your mind to new ideas that don't resonate, that don't fit with your worldview. Simply be curious and listen, because that's all it took for me, was that I was skeptical, but I was curious. And so I explored it, and this is where, it took me. So it took me to this place where I'm now one of the biggest advocates for good nutrition. And 20 years ago, I wouldn't have said anything. Yeah, well, I didn't know anything about it, but I certainly wouldn't be speaking about it as highly as I do today. And that's only because of being a critic, a conscience of society, as an educator, and being curious.
Fantastic, Julia. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for all of it. It's been extremely useful. And yeah, it's been wonderful to host you. So thank you for this.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye, Julia. Take care.